So just to introduce myself, my name is Ali Mardini. I'm a third-year medical student at the Royal College of Surgeons in Ireland, the Bahrain campus. And today I'll be presenting my literature review entitled Eyeing Up the Pandemic, a literature review of the ocular manifestations of COVID-19. So it's an ophthalmology focused publication. And my co-authors on this paper were Dr. Simal Maksud Abdul Qadir, as well as Dr. Khalid Al-Hamsi, who was a supervisor for the project. So just to give a background, now we all know about COVID-19. It's been the pandemic and the talk of the season in the medical world for the past 2 years. And as of now, according to figures on the WHO's page, it has affected 600 million people cumulatively over the past few years who have gotten the disease, leading to over 6 million deaths. And since the discovery of this disease, there has been immense research focus in the field, trying to find out more about the virus in order to contain it, decrease its spread, and find ways to better treat patients who ended up contracting the infection. This sort of research has allowed us to have good insight into the pulmonary and cardiovascular complications of the virus. But there still seems to be a difference in opinion in terms of the ophthalmic implications that the virus could have. And this will be the topic of discussion for my paper. Our objectives were to demonstrate that COVID-19 actually has a potential to do harm on the eye, and illustrate what those ophthalmic effects are, identify the strategies that were used around the world to test ocular tissue for SARS-CoV-2, as well as try to provide a guide for clinicians to look out for certain signs and symptoms that could give them a hint that the patient could have COVID-19, whether it be in an early or late advanced stage. And finally, being a literature review, we highlighted any gaps that we found in the research in the field, and provided guidelines for what should be looked further into in the future. And now for the methodology. So we, with COVID-19 being a very research-centric topic, there was a whole wide variety of publications to look out for. So we decided to go with a more simplistic research strategy because we were sure that we were going to get data saturation when we looked up the medical databases. So we chose a very basic search strategy. We used the PubMed database, and our search terms were eyes, ocular, retina, and SARS-CoV-2. And the range of publications were from the beginning of 2020 all the way up till until mid-August. We were 3 authors, so 2 of us conducted the title and abstract screening with full text review, as well as data extraction, and any conflicts that arose between the 2 independent reviewers were settled by a 3rd reviewer. The inclusion criteria and exclusion criteria are as follows. We only considered the publications that were in the English language and involved an adult population, because a pediatric population might have different implications. And it is well documented that COVID-19 had a much lesser effect on the pediatric population than on adults. So we were not expecting to see as many complications, ophthalmically speaking, with a younger population. And any commentary, editorials, or opinion pieces were excluded, as well as papers that did not have full text readily available online. Our initial search generated 59 studies, and after that, after initial search, we carried out our screening process, and 59 studies went all the way down to 25, which were finally included and extracted for their data. And we used those 25 studies to synthesize the findings of our article. Just to give you an overview of the sorts of literature that we ended up including for our article. So the highest proportion of studies was a cross-sectional review. I mean, a cross-sectional study. So from the 25, we had 8 being cross-sectional, followed by literature reviews, one of which was a systematic review. There were 5 case reports, 3 case series, and 2 cohort studies. So a very eclectic, different sorts of form of studies that were included in different levels of evidence. And we've picked up on all those levels of evidence in our literature review. Now, before I start speaking about the results and the manifestations that we ended up reporting on, I'd just like to give a quick overview of the basic anatomy of the eye for everyone to be familiar with it. So first off, the posterior segment, which is everything behind the lens within the eye. And this would include the vitreous chamber, as well as the retina, the choroid, and the sclera beneath that. As for the anterior segment, there would be the cornea, the iris, and basically every structure in front of the eye. And importantly for our study, the conjunctiva, which is a transparent epithelial layer that could be seen over the sclera on the outer part of the eye, but it does not cover the cornea. You could see it a lot in patients that have pink eye. It's the part of the eye that turns red when a person has pink eye is the conjunctiva, and it's called conjunctivitis. And now to discuss the results. So first off, we wanted to discuss if COVID-19 even had the potential to infect the tissues of the eye, and how would you go about discussing that? So we'd have to talk about the all-famous spike protein. The spike protein is the protein molecule on the surface of the viral envelope of COVID-19. And this would bind to certain receptors on the cell membranes of human tissue. Those receptors were of 2 groups. The first pathway that I will discuss, which was the more prevalent pathway in the literature, is the TMPR-SS2 pathway. It's a bit of a mouthful, but it's quite simple. So a spike protein, in order to allow infection of a cell, would first have to be modified. It will have to be primed. And this would be done by the enzyme TMPR-SS2. It's a transmembrane protease. Once it's been changed by this enzyme, the spike protein would then be able to bind to ACE2, which is also a cell surface protein, or another protein, CD147. So we could have a cell that expresses the transmembrane protease, which is the modifier enzyme, and ACE2, which is the enzyme that receives the modified spike protein, and this would allow infection. Or you could have a different scenario where the spike protein would be modified on one cell, but then it will bind to the ACE2 or CD147 of another cell. This is the more famous pathway. The other less talked about pathway is the integrin pathway. So in the first method I discussed, there had to be a protease enzyme that modified the spike protein. And the second pathway, there was no need for a modifier enzyme. The spike protein would directly bind to integrins, which is a protein molecule that is expressed on the surface of all human cells generally. Because of a particular motif called the RGT motif on the spike protein. And now that we've identified these proteins and the receptors that SARS-CoV-2 requires, as well as the important spike protein, but let's see if those proteins are expressed, if those receptors are expressed by ocular tissue. So I have a table here with a tick mark on every single protein that was expressed relevant to COVID-19 infection. So TMPR-SS2 was expressed in the cornea, conjunctiva, and endothelium. ACE2 was expressed in everything but the retina. CD147 uniquely was only expressed in the retina. So the retina did not have the ACE2 receptor, but it was equipped with the CD147 protein. So it did demonstrate susceptibility to COVID-19 theoretically. in the first and second pathway. And since all human cells generally have integrin, all of the structures of the eye are theoretically susceptible to COVID-19 in the second pathway, as highlighted before. And now for the manifestations. I will first discuss the anterior segment manifestations because these were the most common manifestations of the virus. It primarily affected the anterior segments of the eye, with the most common implication being conjunctivitis, which is commonly outside the medical world, it's called pink eye. I've got a picture here, the left-hand side picture. It demonstrates conjunctivitis. You can see that in conjunctival injection, the patient has a red eye, and typically those patients will have epiphora, which is teary eyes. They'll have too many tears from increased lacrimation. And some patients would have chemosis. Chemosis is the ophthalmic term for like sort of a blister in the conjunctiva. So if you can see at the right-hand picture, there is this sort of swelling in the eye that you can see. It's a collection of fluid that's built up right under the conjunctiva, just above the sclera. And paradoxically, we did say that patients presented with teary eyes, but some patients had dry eyes. They complained of dry eyes. So you could have both ends of the spectrum. And lots of patients would complain of ocular pain. And these symptoms could persist for quite a while. They could be, importantly, the anterior segment manifestations that are all listed here could be the first sign of COVID-19 infection, which is of great importance in the setting of the pandemic that we had, as well as in, God forbid, future cases of outbreak that could arise again, generally. So doctors should be on high alert for these signs, as they could be clues to a patient having COVID-19 and could guide infection control precautions that were implemented around the world. For the posterior segment, there were two sets of manifestations. There were the clinical ones, in which the patient presented with ocular complaints, either from decreased vision, ocular pain, scotomas, and all of that. Or there could be a subclinical presentation. So the patient would not have an ocular complaint, but they would come in to the clinic with other common symptoms of COVID-19, such as dyspnea, fatigue, fever. And then the researchers at that hospital would carry out a ophthalmic exam just to see if there were any subclinical effects. I will first discuss the clinical manifestations, the ones which have the which are most relevant to the patient because they're complaining of these. So a patient would come in with decreased vision or decreased visual acuity, and upon fundoscopy, the ophthalmologist would note retinal hemorrhage. This was the most common sign in patients with ocular complaints when it came to posterior segment manifestations. There were all sorts of retinal hemorrhages, all different kinds of patterns, whether they were flame-shaped, with a blood and thunder appearance characteristic of venous occlusion and venous hemorrhage. There were microhemorrhages, macular hemorrhage, peripapular hemorrhage, all of the sorts. And in cases where patients presented with retinal hemorrhage, they concomitantly often had cotton wool spots, which are the soft exudates, yellow pale patches that could be seen in the retina on fundoscopy. They're a common term when describing diabetic retinopathy. Central retinal artery occlusion as well as central retinal vein occlusion were reported, but they were much less often. But they occurred much less often than retinal hemorrhages. So there would be patients that had venous occlusion and consequent hemorrhage, or mostly there was no occlusion of artery or vein, but there was hemorrhage nonetheless. And this picture here shows a a venous occlusion with characteristic venous engorgement, as well as the hemorrhage that resulted from that within the retina. And another important set of clinical manifestations was the fungal infiltration of the eye. So this generally only occurred in patients that were an extremely severe disease following COVID-19 infection. They had a lot of comorbidities that implicated their health status, such as diabetes, hypertension, and a generally immunocompromised state. The most detrimental disease was fungal endogenous endophthalmitis. This is a fungal infection that seeds in the eye, and it results in general inflammation of every structure contained within the eyeball. So that would include the aqueous humor, the vitreous chamber, and any structure within the eyeball. And you could see in the picture, there's from all the inflammation that results, the pus builds up, and you could see it right under the cornea in the anterior chamber of the eye, and it's described as a hypopyon. Other patients had posterior uveitis, candida retinitis, and importantly, to address the inflammation and the general complaints of patients with COVID, one of the procedures would be to give them glucocorticoids to attenuate the inflammation. This could have increased their chances, the chances of this patient population to get the fungal diseases of the eye that I described. So that's something to keep in mind. Now, the third manifestation to discuss was we investigated if COVID-19 had any neurologic implications in terms of the eye. So on OCT, optical coherence tomography, there was pronounced retinal nerve fiber layer thinning. There was one case report of a patient that had bilateral Addy's syndrome, which is shown on the picture below. This is a unilateral presentation as shown in the picture. The eye on the right eye, which is on the left-hand side of the presentation, is dilated. This is because of damage to cranial nerve 3, the oculomotor nerve. So this could demonstrate that COVID-19 does affect neurons and those nervous system structure generally. And lastly, OCT also showed hyperreflective lesions in the retina for a patient that presented with scotomas. So there were 2 case reports of specific neurologic cases, and retinal nerve fiber layer thinning was reported in a multitude of patients within our study. So I arranged them in descending order of prevalence. The diagnostics that were used to assess whether or not COVID-19 was behind all of this ocular pathology were as follows. Mainly, they do RT-PCR tests on ocular samples, OCT was conducted, and serology for COVID-19 antibodies were also used. And also a few studies used electron microscopy to see if they could visualize viral particles within eye structures like the retina. And in order to find out if their eye even had potential to be infected by COVID-19, in the discussion that I gave about the COVID-19 receptors like TMPR, like ACE2, CD147, and the integrins, and all those. Post-mortem samples were taken from patients that had died from COVID-19, and ophthalmic tissue was investigated using immunohistochemistry and Western blot to try and demarcate these receptors. One important thing that we reported on was, even though case reports would mention, or other sort of studies, cross-sectional studies or any of those, would mention that they diagnosed they diagnosed the patients as having ocular manifestations from a COVID-19 infection. Upon testing with PCR tests, they would get a negative result. And we hypothesize, as shared in some papers, that this could just have been an inadequacy from the testing method. So, for example, we know in Pap smears, there is a downfall in terms of, there is a shortcoming in terms of inadequate sampling because of the particular location where the samples are taken from. The doctor or the physician might not get a good enough sample for the test to come up as positive. And this could have been the same case here. The sample that was taken from the eye could have been insufficient for the test to come up as positive, even when it was. So some of the cases got false negative tests, even though they should have come up as positives. All in all, the American Academy of Ophthalmology reports that during the time of the pandemic, everyone was on high alert. So ophthalmologists generally, and doctors too, from other specialties, would be on high alert and suspect potential COVID-19 infection in patients that presented with pink eye, especially if they had the other pathognomonic findings for the time of the pandemic, such as a patient presenting with a flu, decreased smell sensation, decreased taste sensations. Now, post-pandemic, where not everyone is, it's not like every patient comes in with pink eye, that guy has COVID-19. No, right now the guidelines are that it's kept as a differential. COVID-19 is kept as a differential, but it's only seriously considered if other tests and other signs and symptoms come up as positive for COVID-19. The takeaways from our study are that the eyes do demonstrate effects on the eye, that COVID-19 does demonstrate effects on the eye, whether that be the anterior segment or the posterior segment. It does exhibit its effects on neural tissue. So we discussed its effects on the retina directly and its effects on cranial nerve 3, as well as hyperreflective lesions that led to scotomas. So it does exhibit neurotropism and general ophthalmic propensity of damage. The most common manifestations to look out for are conjunctivitis, wet eyes, dry eyes, as well as a complaint of ocular pain. The posterior segment manifestations generally only occur in severe cases, and even if they do, they are mostly subclinical, with the general ophthalmic prognosis of COVID-19 being a good prognosis. It's not a very dangerous disease for patients in terms of their vision, but it is a good marker for COVID-19 infection generally in presentation, and it would help guide physicians into the appropriate infection control precautions to take to avoid further infection within the community. And thank you all for listening. I hope this paper cleared up a lot about the ocular effects of COVID-19, and I welcome any questions you may have. And I just want to give special thanks to both doctors Ahmed Mardini and Asher Khan, who had provided their guidance and support throughout our research project.
Thank you, Ali, for this informative and interesting presentation. Any question to Dr. Ali?